Hi, thank you for coming today. I'm going to present on my dissertation, the proposal for it. So I'm going to talk about culture and context, how norms, frames, and teaching of learning change for graduate student instructors. Here's sort of the outline of the talk and also a rough schedule. So I'll talk for about 25 minutes maybe. Then my committee will ask me questions and then they'll kick me out of the room so they can privately talk about me. But yeah, so we're gonna get started by first, I'm gonna give us an outline of the talk. So I'll motivate the discussion first. I'll talk about conceptual perspectives after that, and then we'll get into the meat of the discussion. So I want to motivate the study through discussing a problem space that I'm in. That's bothering me. Okay. So for theoretical or applied mathematics, the problem space is usually about proving a theorem or developing algorithms to solve problems. At the heart of it, those research is about understanding something, understanding a problem. In math eds, that's the same thing. It's about identifying an aspect of education, like how we teach or how students learn, and we try to understand more of it or the nuance around it. So for my research, I'm looking at this problem of exclusion, culture of exclusion, where at large, the subject of mathematics limits every student's ability to sort of see themselves as being capable learners of mathematics, whether that be through how they can participate in the classroom or other parts of their education career. And this ties into this sort of grand challenge to change the perception of what it means to do mathematics. And again, here, the problem is not necessarily changing what it means to do math, because as research mathematicians, we know that the subject is about exploration, creative thinking, problem solving, but the culture at large has framed our subject as one that sort of prevents students from being able to see that creativity, that problem solving, that like exploration. And so that's sort of the idea of this culture of exclusion. So much like other research problems or research areas, you need an approach to the problem. And so I'll first narrow it down. I'll narrow down mathematics education to the college context as opposed to the whole K through 12, K through 16. And since that's the context that we're all in, I want to take a second to explicitly say that this is not a call out of any individual. Culture is made up of large groups of people, spans hundreds, tens of years of development. So it's not an individual's fault that this culture persists. But in tiny or maybe large ways, the culture shapes our understanding and practice and teaching practices in ways that we might not even notice. And so my assumption is that this happens really early on, back to our sort of experience of teaching as graduate students. So my approach to the problem is to understand how new graduate student instructors begin to learn how they want to teach, but also how the way that they teach is beginning to be shaped by external forces. So here I'd like to take a second to sort of motivate what a conceptual perspective is before I talk about my perspectives. So choosing a conceptual perspective is like in theoretical mathematics, where we choose a structure for thinking about key ideas. For example, different topologies give you different understandings of what distance is, what continuity is, what compactness is. So it's not necessarily that one conceptual perspective is the correct one or it's better. It's all about what it affords our understanding of the problem space. So here, one conceptual perspective that I have is that the way someone frames teaching and learning shapes how they sort of notice classroom events. And one way we can sort of understand this notice is through three interrelated actions. So we might attend to nonverbal cues like looks of confusions, raised hands, or verbal things like the use of terminology, or maybe stuff that happens in discussion groups in the classroom. It's about identifying what's the most important thing to you to address in the classroom. Interpret and respond is sort of what you expect them to be. We're interpreting or understanding what we just saw, what we just attended to, and now we get to respond to it in some form or another. And so what this conceptual perspective says is that there's this overarching frame that sort of surrounds all these three ways of noticing. Right, so let's take a step back because I just threw a frame word at you, and I want to discuss what that is. So for me, I think about it as a structure and filter in my idea, in my head, that lets me know how I'm supposed to appropriately act in a situation. My favorite example is the different frames that we have when we're at a kitchen table versus when we're at a classroom. You're doing sort of different things that are like appropriate in different contexts. And I like this example because it highlights that one individual can have multiple frames, that one frame cannot work in every context, in every situation. You have to sort of change it. You have to sort of adapt. But to bring it back to mathematics, though, you can sort of think about different frames of teaching for like maybe you're teaching calculus 1 versus you're teaching algebra. So in that context, even though you're teaching math in both cases, you have a different frame for it. So here's some more broader examples of like frames of teaching and learning. All right. So I talked about how people can have multiple frames depending on the situation, but an important perspective to have with these is that these are not set in stone. They can change. And sort of two ways that I'm thinking about how these change is maybe through the passive influence of culture. I've talked about it before, like this idea that you are being shaped by the culture around you, like sharing casual stories during lunchtime. Like your colleague just tells you, oh my God, I'm having such a hard time like getting students to engage with me because I'm doing X, Y, and Z. But then in your head, you were thinking of doing X, Y, and Z, but they just told you that it's not engaging. So then you're going to change like what you're going to do in the classroom to not do X, Y, and Z. But then there's this also intentional and active process of reframing. So for example, like you were just told like X, Y, and Z didn't work, or like you saw X, Y, and Z when you were a student, and now you're going to actively try to do something else. And so that is reframing because you're actively engaging in changing your frame. Okay. And the last piece of this conceptual perspectives that I'll discuss today is norms. Norms are rules and expectations. They shape who gets to speak in the classroom, who offers the solution, how many solutions you even get to discuss in the classroom. And so my perspective is that these sort of rules and expectations are informed by how you frame your teaching and your students' learning. Take a pause there. All right. So let's get into the meat of the dissertation itself. So I've discussed the problem space. I've discussed some perspectives that I have, but let's get into the research questions. So there's this central research question, which is talking directly to the problem space that I have. But it's typically like a much larger problem that it's very difficult to tackle like straight on. Sort of like asking yourself to solve the Navier-Stokes equation. It's kind of hard, kind of have to specify what about it you want to do. So this research question is asking a broader sort of view of what is it about culture that shapes our frames and norms, and relatedly, like finding out specific moments, events in teaching that sort of produce those changes. But I also want to talk about how kind of started this discussion with like a very like, with the culture of exclusion like talk. But I want to note that culture can also have a positive impact on somebody. And so I like spread this question out to be like exclusionary and inclusionary or inclusive like culture. So the next things is, so the central question is massive. So I kind of tackle it with 3 specific research questions. And for me, these research questions like came from looking at the central question and asking myself, like, how can I even begin to understand this massive question? And so in other words, the first question is just going back to the roots of like, how do instructors even think about these concepts in the first place? And I found it interesting to ask it in the context of before they teach, while they're teaching, and after they teach for the first time. The second is unpacking the moments in teaching that may cause these changes. So that was just specifically about like a story. The third is going back to that perspective that I have that frames shape things in the classroom. Okay. Right. So I want to talk about the design using the sort of research questions that I just had. In math ed, there's a lot of ways to answer a research question. You can kind of think about this as either choosing to do a direct proof or maybe a proof by contradiction. That's sort of like a baby example of like the different ways that you could solve something. In my case, the questions, the context that I'm in, and even the design all work together to improve the questions of how do I even begin to understand a central question. So these questions did not just spur out of the central question. It was in dialogue of like the design that I was trying to build. So the first one I want to talk about is this idea of grounded theory. Grounded theory is a design where the data leads you to a theoretical understanding. It emphasizes a small group of participants, which works well in my context. So the idea, not to use the words to define it, but it's building theory from the ground up. So I'm collecting data, and as more and more data pile up, as it builds, the clearer and clearer my theoretical understanding becomes of the situation. So in this case, the theoretical understanding is, how do instructors think about frames and norms? And if those differ at different points of your teaching. I like grounded theory for two reasons. One, again, it emphasizes a small group of participants, so it works really well in the context that I'm in. Second, I also get to know that I'm not projecting my own frames and norms onto what I see. The data itself is what builds the understanding. My argument is based on the data itself. And so I don't get to tell what the data says. I'm only there to follow the sort of trajectory where it leads me. The next question is narrative inquiry. That's another design where but this time the focus is rather on gathering and then reconstructing stories from participants' lived experiences, and then taking a page out of like critical theories in the class that I'm taking. I know how important stories and narrative are in understanding nuances of experiences, especially in teaching. And this design also gives me a good structure for dealing with multiple forms of data that I like, where there's a social, there's a time, and there's a context aspect of it. So it's very organized. For the mathematicians in the crowd, I know I just lost you a bit there. The biggest takeaway from these designs is the importance of narrative and context in understanding sort of the captured classroom events. The important takeaway here is that nothing happens in a vacuum or in a random instance. Events and actions stem from somewhere else. And so I want to sort of build that sort of somewhere else in the understanding. And together these designs pair well with addressing the central question. It's about understanding the theory of culture's influence on how someone thinks about their frames and norms. And along that, also some stories of moments in teaching. All right, so let's talk about what I'm actually doing for the study, the context that I'm in, what's happening here. I'm doing the study at a large public Midwestern university, where the populations that I want to study are the GSIs, who are teaching as instructors of record for the first time for one of these 4 classes. Some important context for this group is that they're required to attend a teaching orientation a few weeks prior to when they first start teaching in their first semester. But also in their first year of teaching as instructors of record, they're all are required to take a pedagogy course with every other person in their situation. So there's this sort of cohort of students that like learn how to teach for the first time together. And more importantly, this is the first time that graduate students have to juggle teaching content as well as their own responsibilities to their own graduate career. Okay. I think this is a good place to sort of take a pause and answer a question that's probably brewing in your head. Why am I focusing on graduate students and also their first time teaching? Because there's like different instructors, there's different times that you teach. Why am I specifically doing this? Well, there's many reasons, like logistically speaking, the percentage of undergraduates being taught by a graduate student has increased quite a bit since the turn of the millennia. But education research speaking, we saw in the beginning, kind of didn't really highlight it, but there's a need to understand what graduate students go through in their teaching experiences to understand how they develop as future college instructors. But a personal motivation of mine is that graduate school is where I'm beginning to be molded as an instructor, one way or another. And it can't be a black box of enter as a student, leave as a college instructor. There are narratives that hold importance within these 4 to 6 years that we're in this black box, especially in that first year of teaching, which can be so stressful. And things can't change or improve unless we know and become aware to change these things. Right. So now let's get into the data. So first, I want to talk about how I split the phases. There's a pre-semester, there's a in-semester, and then there's a post-semester. So this all happens within the span of like an academic year. In the pre-semester phase, this was a week before their orientation. I wanted to collect information about how graduate students thought about teaching and learning even before they got a teaching orientation, thought about it as sort of like a baseline, like this is what a graduate student usually walks into a classroom with before, or walks into orientation with. Instead of talking to you through how I will and am analyzing data, I just want to talk about the philosophy and sort of motivation behind it. So there's two things here. Holistic view is drawn upon this idea that to understand somebody's frame, you can't look at line by line. You're gonna lose something if you're looking at it so focused. You need the context around it. You have to look more broadly. It's the idea, again, that nothing happens in a vacuum. Something stems from somewhere else. But that's not to say that you shouldn't look at something line by line. You shouldn't look at something so microscopically. Especially when I'm looking at transcripts for the first time. I don't really have an idea what I'm sort of looking for yet. So it's good to look for like line by line and ask myself the question, is this speaking to how this person thought about their role as an instructor and what actions surround that? So that's like a good question to ask myself when I'm looking at it so specifically. But yeah, and they work in tandem here. So with that philosophy set, I'll just sort of talk you through the rest of the phases. For the in-semester stage, I focused on 3 grad students. This time I did get to choose which ones I wanted to focus on. I chose one instructor for each class, and they're all coming into this role, and it worked out really well. They have variations in sort of their experiences before they got into this institution. With 3 grad students, I can really focus on that cycle of collect, analyze, update, collect, analyze, update, meaning that the more observations I do, the more the interviews get specific to what I see in their classrooms, and what I see in their classroom then gets informed by what we talk about in the interview. So there's this sort of nice cycle that happens. The smaller group also helps me when it comes to reconstructing the stories and the narratives. With 3, it becomes manageable. With more than that, it's probably going to be unruly to collect all those stories. All right. So for the post-semester stage, I want to increase the participants to more graduate students. For some of the data collection, to keep on building that grounded theory procedure from the ground up. But at first, I want to finish the 3 stories that I was capturing in the semester. One of the cool new things that I want to try is sort of this historiograph-like activity that I'm going to give the graduate student instructor. It's sort of just a very simplified view, and I understand that you are condensing a lot of information, but that's sort of its purpose. It's designed to be very simplistic, supposed to be like you get to look at it and be like, and notice that, whoa, what happened in that day? Like what happened in that week? And sort of be able to start posing questions. So it's sort of just a nice brief, here's a picture, now we get to talk about it some more. And I think it'll pair well with like sort of the journal entries and the interviews that I do in the semester. So yeah. So here is a really big slide with a lot of text in it. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I did hand it out to my committee. This is just saying that the research questions that I did pose can be addressed by the data that I am collecting. So I'm not just like collecting data that isn't going to be related to the research. But yeah, but for the sake of time, I want to like sort of jump into the implications that I have. So one of the things that I'm working on before and also through the research and the data collection has been sort of a deconstruction of what a frame is and useful for understanding it in the context of teaching and learning. This is sort of like my like insistence that I like deconstruct something so I can for sure say that this is what I'm seeing. And nobody can argue against it. But the leftmost column is what one researcher like came up with for any context, and the rest of the other column is sort of like my deconstruction of what it would maybe kind of fizzle out to be in the context of teaching and learning. So that's just one implication that I have for the theoretical world. But broadly speaking, though, I think my dissertation, and I believe it, has implications for both theory and practice. In the last slide, we saw the theory implication of things. The table can help unpack what frames of teaching and learning are, but my dissertation also hopes to clarify how frames and norms shape how instructors notice things. For the instructors in the classroom, though, it's, I think, comforting to know that your frame or your approach to teaching is not set in stone. they can, they will, and probably should change as you get more experience, and that you're not stuck doing the same thing. What my research hopes to find are what moments in teaching pushes us to change our approach, if those moments even really exist. And on a critical perspective, the reason I want narratives from first-time instructors is because I want to pass on these stories onto new instructors. I like to make them feel like it's okay for it to be messy. It's okay for it to be rough. This is sort of the idea that's going on in that sort of criticalness of it. So the experiences, and this is sort of the last thing that I'll say, the experience of teaching for the first time is so unique and short-lived in the grand scheme of things, right? But it's also where instructors begin to shape how they want and how they will teach in the future. So it's important for us to sort of get into that black box that I mentioned. And even if it's a small cohort of people, that's still more than 0 stories that needed to be told. And that is the end of my presentation.